In this video, we're going to talk about Rostow's model of economic development. That's one of our two sort of broad macroeconomic theories of development that we talk about in this class, along with Wallerstein. So, first of all, think about Rostow. Very, very different than Wallerstein, both in its worldview and in its sort of the way that it works. So it's part of an overall theory called Modernization Theory. And essentially what that seeks to do is to explain sort of the process of development, sort of the different stages a country goes through in terms of development. So the way that looks like is here. A country starts off in what we would consider to be a more traditional society, heavily kind of based on subsistence agriculture, and essentially goes through the process of industrialization, which is sort of a synonym for stage 3 takeoff. Sort of the stages 2 and 4 are transitional stages between pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial societies. So Rostow's model sort of represents a move away from a lot of the self-sufficiency and nationalization strategies that a lot of countries used in the 20th century. Most notably, the communist kind of powers of the 20th century, like the USSR and China. And also, thinking about other examples, Mexico, India, both countries that did a lot of protectionist policies, essentially policies that protected their own companies and domestic companies in the country, that had tariffs on foreign goods, that essentially didn't look outward in terms of free trade, and were sort of trying to build up their own economy rather than integrate them into the world economy. And Rostow's model sort of represents most countries have sort of moved away from those types of policies, and Rostow's model sort of represents the idea that the end goal for countries is to ultimately integrate their economy into the global system through trade and exports. So as we said before, Rostow has 5 stages as opposed to Wallerstein's 3. And the stages themselves are different in that they represent sort of a chronological progression rather than sort of a distinct category. So one term that I'm going to use, and I want to talk about a little bit beforehand, is the term comparative advantage. So this is a kind of a macroeconomic term that talks about an individual business, but also individual countries' ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower cost than its competitors or its trading partners. So thinking about this in sort of the country perspective, countries at different levels of development will have different comparative advantages for manufacturing. So you might have certain types of manufacturing in less developed countries because of things like labor costs. You might have countries that have advantages based on their physical location, or the availability of certain natural resources in terms of producing a good. So the way I always explain this is, obviously countries that have Mediterranean style agriculture would have a comparative advantage in terms of the production of wine, and will usually produce a lot of it. And you can kind of apply that sort of logic to agriculture, but also to other types of manufacturing outside of agriculture. And then also kind of comparative advantage might be a part of whether or not a country is involved in some sort of trade agreement or common market that allows them to trade goods or services at lower rates than they otherwise would. So this sort of has the connotation that countries are eventually going to figure out what they're good at making, and specialize in the manufacturing of products in which they hold a comparative advantage. And that's one way in which countries sort of go through the process of development. So kind of these are the 5 models that we look at. Stage 1, traditional society. Stage 2, preconditions for takeoff. Stage 3, takeoff. Stage 4, drive to maturity. And then stage 5, the age of mass consumption, sometimes also the age of mass production. You see that's sort of both. Those two probably go hand in hand. So these are the 5 stages of Rostow. So stage 1, this is a stage in which the economy hasn't really started yet to develop by sort of the modern metrics that we use. So still heavily dependent on subsistence farming. You can look at individual country or individual societies or groups within countries that still represent sort of this idea of traditional society. So there's not a lot of foreign investment within the country. It's predominantly rural. And the economy really hasn't started to make the changes needed to industrialize. So the country examples I picked were sort of some of the poorest countries in the world in terms of still predominantly rural, still have really high fertility rates and large family sizes. and still are categorized by rates of subsistence farming that are in the 80s or 90s. So Mali, Chad, Niger were the countries I used for that. All right, stage 2, like we said before, is kind of a transitional stage between um, traditional society and industrialization. So this is when you start to see activity within the primary sector change a little bit. So it goes from being that sort of subsistence agriculture type farming more to extraction of natural resources that looks like mining or plantation style farming. So some examples might be like palm oil extraction in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia, or coffee production in Central America. So you have sort of the purpose of primary sector activity changing and a reduction in subsistence farming. It starts to attract lots of kind of increased levels of foreign investment. And I think the main word that I would use to describe this stage is sort of an investment in infrastructure. So a country starts to build up its infrastructure so that it can actually go through the process of industrialization. So the countries that I would include in this stage now are Nigeria and Angola, two African countries with lots and lots and lots of economic growth that have, in some ways, maybe even started a little bit at stage 3, but still have kind of predominant, uh, still source a little bit of stagnation in terms of the overall kind of industrialization of the country. All right, so stage 3 is kind of a short period of intense industrialization. So that's called takeoff. Usually, this coincides with really, really strong economic growth. So a country sort of going through this massive change within their own economy, where the primary sector decreases dramatically, and we have a kind of an overall shift to manufacturing and services. So not surprisingly, this kind of coincides with rural to urban migration, where you have a lot of people leaving rural parts of the country and moving to a city. So you might see things like squatter settlements or slums developing kind of within large cities that are not necessarily designed to support that amount of people. But you have a lot of manufacturing that sort of pops up within the country usually. And usually this manufacturing is what we call low value added manufacturing, which essentially means that they are producing sort of lower cost goods. Textiles is usually a really good example of where you see textile manufacturing. You often will see kind of the countries that are just going into this stage, just going through what we call takeoff, in that you have a lot of kind of labor costs are dictating that it's cheaper to produce these types of goods in countries that are newly industrializing. Um, so country examples right now that I would give are India and Bangladesh. Maybe a little bit more so Bangladesh than India, which you could argue maybe has sort of crept a little bit into the next stage. But these are countries that I would say are kind of right at that point, or right near that point. All right, so drive to maturity is stage 4. So technology becomes more integrated into manufacturing. So workers are more skilled and specialized. So the way that I sort of explain this is the country sort of figures out what it's good at making, and it starts to make a lot of whatever it's good at making. So that's where the term comparative advantage comes in. The idea that um, there are certain comparative advantages that countries have in terms of making a good. It might be a high tech manufacturing good, like we saw in Asia with China and South Korea and Taiwan. It might be that there is a specific kind of style of farming, like we see in South America and Chile and Argentina, where there's a lot of wine production and a lot of Mediterranean agriculture and a lot of beef production and things like that. So the economy essentially starts to specialize in whatever they're good at, as well as you see more diversification within the economy, in that it is not sort of based on like heavy manufacturing or in manufacturing that's just kind of lower levels. The standards of living within the country start to increase pretty significantly. Economic improvement, and then you have this sort of drive to economic improvements, and the diffusion, kind of the economic improvements that we might see in urban parts of the country, sort of in the previous stage, are actually spread a little bit kind of throughout the country. And kind of continuing, we have external investments in the country that are that are sort of investments in the type of manufacturing that the country is good at. So some examples, I would say Chile and Argentina are sort of squarely in this stage now. If you think about where some of the countries that are now more developed countries, but the term Asian tigers is thrown around. That is South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore. Those countries were probably in this stage in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, where we saw their economies grow significantly. All right, and the last one is called the age of mass production, sometimes consumption. High levels of economic development, the manufacturing, kind of the people who work in manufacturing actually starts to creep downward. You actually have technology and automation taking over. That's maybe a more recent occurrence. Kind of in a past occurrence is that we have the outsourcing of those types of jobs outside of the country. But the actual amount of manufacturing in terms of dollars goes up because the manufacturing oftentimes is shifts to sort of being high value goods, high value added goods. And the economy itself is sort of experiencing this overall shift to a service-based economy, like the United States, where we have 75 or 80% of our jobs based in services. And then these economies are sort of considered to be fully mature. So the U.S. would be the example that we would use for this one. All right, so some final thoughts on Rostow. Kind of an overall gives us a little bit rosier picture of development than Wallerstein. It sort of has the assumption that countries are able to go through all of the different stages and that it's possible for a country through sort of outside investment and through figuring out kind of what it's good at and making a lot of it, that it can kind of eventually kind of hit this last stage or go through kind of develop its economy. So some major differences than what we saw with Wallerstein. All right, thanks. Bye.